Welcome everyone to the Invasive Species Center brand new webinar series. My name is Leah Hodgson. I am the Communications Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center, and I'm going to be moderating today. Today's webinar is the first in our new series that's going to feature invasive species experts and a new topic each month. It also happens to fall within Invasive Plant Pest and Invasive Species Month under the United Nations International Year of Plant Health, so our content today is very timely on that front. Before we get started, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Invasive Species Center. So we're a not-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. And that's us up on the screen there. Nice little team photo. We've got lots of great invasive species resources up on our website, so check us out at www.invasivespeciescenter.ca. If you click on Get News under the Get Involved tab, you can sign up for event and webinar invitations, which is where we're going to be sending out updates for future webinars in this series. You can also sign up for our quarterly newsletter where we put out new resources and blog posts and invasive species updates. That's the one on the left of your screen there. And we also send out a bi-weekly media research and event scan. That's the one on the right, where we curate current invasive species news articles and research. And we also have a new event section, which is where we're listing invasive species events and webinars across Canada. So before I pass it over to Kyle, I want to go over a few logistics items. So there's going to be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question at any time, you could type it into the question box on your panel there, and we'll go through them at the end. If you're having any technical difficulties, please type them in the chat box. Let us know. You can send me an email if you'd like. We'll try and resolve that for you. And also, there's going to be a very brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have time, please take a minute and fill it out. We would really appreciate your feedback. So today's webinar is titled Controlling the Spread of European Water Chestnut and Parrot Feather in Ontario. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, who is Kyle Borrowman. Kyle is a biologist at Ducks Unlimited Canada with over 10 years of experience in aquatic plant management within Ontario. This includes the use of mechanical, biological, and chemical control techniques to manage various invasive aquatic plants. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you now to get started.
Great, thanks, Leah. Hopefully I sound okay. The volumes are all right.
Sounds good to me.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, hi everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. Over the past 3 years, I've been working with Ducks Unlimited Canada, managing a few different invasive species projects. And so a little bit before I get into those, Ducks Unlimited Canada has been actively conserving wetland habitat for over 80 years and delivering habitat conservation programs across Ontario since 1974. In that time, we've completed more than 3,800 habitat project segments across the province and have conserved almost 1 million acres of wetlands to date. Our mission is really to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl, which in turn also benefit other wildlife, people, and our environment. So how do we manage invasives? So we do this a few different ways. We tackle invasive species through policy development, science-based research, education and outreach, fostering partnerships, and active habitat restoration. And this includes invasive species control projects. As mentioned by Leah, 2020 is the year of International Plant Health, and invasive species are a major stressor on our native plant communities and natural biodiversity. Part of our goal is protection and rehabilitation of these natural ecosystems. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of plants that I spent a lot of time with. Okay, so I see there's a cursor as well, so I'm going to use that to point from time to time, and there's a bit of lag, so just bear with me. So on the left, we have a rosette of European water chestnut, and on the right, we've got some emergent shoots of parrot feather. So, you know, they are very, very luxuriant looking plants, to say the least, but really don't be deceived. They can wreak a lot of havoc on our lakes and water bodies if they're introduced. So for this reason, they were actually designated as prohibited species under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. And so under this act, it's illegal to import, possess, deposit, release, transport, breed, grow, buy, sell, lease, and trade these species. So one thing I'm going to point out now before I kind of go forward, this is a very Ontario-centric presentation. So I do talk about some other areas as well, but just keep that in mind for people outside of the province. To do this work that we've been underneath the Invasive Species Act, Ducks Unlimited has obtained authorization under the Act to possess and transport these species. So this kind of helps us as well as we're going along. So I'm going to start off with some life history about European water chestnut and our efforts to control the plants in Ontario. But before transitioning over to parrot feather, I'm losing my spot here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the life history of the two and control of the plants. And if we have time at the end, I've got a few other food for thought ideas about aquatic plant management. So these two plants have very, very unique and very different growth, but they do have a lot of impacts on our environment that are somewhat similar. So let's get started on European water chestnut. So this species is an annual floating leaf aquatic plant, and it's native to Eurasia and Africa. So as an annual, every year it drops seed, dies at the end of the year, and then grows the next year from those deposited seeds. It was first introduced in the late 1800s as an ornamental species, but mostly because of its unique look and growth habit. After a series of accidental and intentional releases, water chestnut worked its way across the northeastern United States, across 12 states, and most notably through New York State, where it has reached Lake Ontario as well. Its distribution across Ontario consists of small, isolated populations, and in comparison to the US, we have very little really in comparison. So looking at the map here, the first introduction was actually, first noticed population was in 2005 in the Ottawa River, and this is at Voyageur Provincial Park. In 2011, it was identified in the St. Lawrence River on Wolfe Island, kind of in some of the coastal wetlands along the island there. And another discovery in 2014 in the Rideau River, which is part of the Rideau Canal system. So with that in mind, a little bit about its habitat. These plants really do thrive in nutrient-rich waters. Areas where it's slow-moving with soft substrates, where they have access to full sun, and they optimally grow in about 1 to 2 meters of water. So why are they a problem? So one of the major things that they do is they can really, really quickly create dense floating mats that outcompete native plants. They're actually capable of intercepting about 95% of the sunlight that can reach below the canopy. So this can be very devastating for the community. When you have large, dense mats like this, decaying plants can lower the dissolved oxygen in the water and cause fish kills. As well, it negatively impacts habitat for fish, waterfowl, and other wildlife, and can impede navigation and recreational use of waterways. So here's a good example in the western end of the Erie Canal, where it has completely choked it out, making it very, very difficult to drive a boat through. As well, the seeds can be very sharp if stepped on, and can be a bit of a hazard. And so really in Voyageur Provincial Park, this was how they were first identified in 2005, where someone who was camping at the campground had stepped on one of the seeds, and they were alerted to this issue. So what does it look like? Oh. So all around, it is a very unique looking plant. It has distinct, different leaf structures. So the floating leaves consist of diamond-shaped leaves with toothed margins that are arranged from a rosette, and they're connected by long, spongy petioles. You can kind of see a float here on the petiole of the leaf, which assists in keeping the leaves up at the surface, keeping this rosette at the surface. They also have small adventitious roots that are feather-like finely divided roots that submersed leaves that act like adventitious roots as well. So if the plants become severed, they can actually reroot in shallow waters where these adventitious roots are able to take hold. You can have multiple rosettes per plant, up to about a dozen, and they reach about 30 centimeters in diameter. And flowers are small with 4 white petals, and they're borne singly in the axils of the floating leaves. after flowering, and flowering does occur throughout the summer. Once a flower is ready to produce seed, it does produce a hard seed or nut, which is about the size of a squash ball, and it has 4 sharp spines, and each rosette can produce about 10 to 15 seeds. These seeds sink to the sediment, and they're viable for up to 10 years. And interestingly, their shape allows them to kind of anchor into the substrate. And so early in the season, as that first rosette's reaching the surface of the water, it puts its energy in reaching the surface of the water so that it can allocate starches back through the plant, create that energy to develop the roots, and those seeds actually kind of help to anchor them in place before the roots are developed. So as an annual plant, it does put a lot of effort into producing large viable seeds, and these are used to establish and sustain new populations. Control of the species should really focus on depleting established seed banks of these viable seeds and limiting the production of new seed that would replenish the population. So if we're removing them before they drop the seeds, we can eventually really just deplete that seed bank that can be persistent up to 10 years. This works really in our favor because a lot of invasive plants rely on multiple forms of reproduction, fragmentation being one of the worst to deal with. However, if you do have this consistent control year after year, you can really make a huge difference. But if they are left to their own devices, they can rapidly take over in a huge area. So understanding the growth and habit of the species is vital for a successful control program. Like all species, there are unique challenges and efforts that need to be tailored to meet their specific needs. And in Ontario, we've actually used 3 different methods, main methods. So hand pulling, which is actually one of the methods that we use mostly with our program with Ducks Unlimited, which consists of gently pulling on the rosettes to pull the entire plant out of the water. This can be done in kind of mid-July. Mid-July, the stems are really strong, and you're able to pull roots and all the plants fairly easy out of the water. They are rooted in soft substrates, so that makes it quite easy as well. Harvesters and cutter boats are used for larger populations, and these are used to cut the plants below the surface of the water, so detaching those rosettes from the stem, and those rosettes are then collected. This method needs to be repeated because you do have growth from those broken stems that can reoccur. And lastly, something that we've done recently in Ontario is chemical control, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we did there. So things to keep in mind again: timing of treatment to limit seed production, regrowth from rooted stems, and collection of dislodged rosettes, and really that seed viability concern. So I think I might have hammered that home by now, but I guess we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done here in Ontario. And I won't spend too much time here, but the folks over at Voyageur Provincial Park were able to provide me with a little bit of background on the work that they've done in the last year. And thanks, Sabrina, for that. So this population was the first that was identified in Ontario in the Ottawa River at Voyageur Provincial Park. So control of chestnut by park staff started in 2008, and the project quickly grew from 3 people in canoes hand pulling to a larger crew, about 15 to 16 people per year, using specialized cutter boats, which we have a picture of there, and collector boats to collect the rosettes after they've been cut. They also use canoes, 2 canoes with the 2 cutter boats and 2 collector boats to do this large-scale mechanical harvesting. And so, in addition, they also have a crew in canoes and waders that are hand pulling the plants in areas where it's too shallow. Some of the areas are full of stumps and rocks, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. And it makes it difficult to get in for mechanical harvesting. So it is present in the 4 bays along Ottawa River within the park. So we've got West Bay, Hughes Bay, Champlain Bay, and Iroquois Bay. And the largest populations that they have now are really in these areas of Hughes Bay and Iroquois Bay, which they've used containment booms to keep those populations kept within the bay. Here's a picture of Iroquois Bay here. And last year they had 3,000 feet of containment booms to keep these in place. And through their control in these heavily infested areas, they removed a total of 67 of 71 acres of full surface coverage of water chestnut in Iroquois and Hughes Creek Bay in 2019. So that's all within those floating barriers. And so this really is to further exhaust the seed bank that's there. So in the final 4 acres that have been untouched, it's full of tree stumps and rocks, which is making efficiency with the harvester very difficult, and much of the work is being done by hand picking and raking. In addition, the 2 other bays, Champlain and West, as well as the shorelines in between, which is about 15 kilometers, were monitored and cleared this past year at 100%. So following years of control at this site, native plants have been observed to be returning to many areas that have been under control for a few years. Heavily infested areas that have been successfully cleared for 3 to 4 years consistently show dramatic improvement, and so that handpicking is really necessary just to do full control each year. And there have been no new populations found within the park boundaries or along the Ontario shoreline of the Ottawa River between Voyageur Provincial Park and Hawkesbury. So this population of Voyageur really speaks to the ability of the plant to rapidly create dense populations that need repetitive control to keep the populations in check. And the experience gained through Voyageur has really influenced how we control water chestnut in the province. And it was really instrumental in the approach of managing new populations as they were discovered. So with our water chestnut program, populations were discovered early enough that we didn't really need to deal with this large scale, but definitely took a lot of notes and learned a lot from the crew over at Voyageur, and continue to as well. So I'm going to dig in now about our European water chestnut program with Ducks Unlimited Canada. So since 2014, we've coordinated this program, and it consists of performing active control of known populations and surveillance for new populations every year. In addition, we perform ongoing research and education about water chestnut and other invasives. During the initial year of the program, funding was actually made available through the Invasive Species Center. And in the following years after that, we received some Canada-Ontario agreement funding through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And in 2019, we received additional funding from Parks Canada to manage populations within the Rideau Canal Historic Site. So our program was initiated to manage populations along Wolfe Island. So here we go, we're in Lake Ontario, right at the mouth of St. Lawrence River. And we've got the first and the largest of the Frontenac Islands that start the Thousand Islands chain going through the St. Lawrence River. And we've been managing right here in Wolfe Island at Button Bay, Bayfield Bay, and Lewis Bay. Bayfield Bay and Button Bay were the first 2 populations that we were managing. Lewis Bay was discovered later in the program. As well, this here is part of the Rideau Canal system, and this is the Greater Cataraqui River. And we have a couple of populations here that we've actually done a couple of herbicide treatments the last couple of years. And one other thing with our ongoing surveillance, this is a map of the areas that we performed surveillance in 2019. So really looking at those suitable habitats where the plant could exist throughout Lake Ontario, eastern Lake Ontario, and the St. Lawrence River. And so really from Brighton all the way into the Thousand Islands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on Wolfe Island. There we go. So that lag got me again. Okay, so the Wolfe Island population, really a majority of our work controlling water chestnut through the program has been on Wolfe Island, which is located just south of Kingston. And our largest population has been in Bayfield Bay. This is the largest section within Bayfield Bay where we find the plants. And so this is located along the southern shore of Wolfe Island, big coastal wetland. And we've also worked in Button Bay since the beginning of the program, controlling, which is now consists of only a handful of plants that we're removing each year. As well, in 2017, I was out with the previous program coordinator, Justin White, and we were doing some late season surveillance and identified a new population in Lewis Bay in 2017, and quickly got to action to remove the plants that were there and included that with our program. So each year we spend about 20 days out on the water actively removing water chestnut. before the seeds can mature in the late summer. The location of each plant is marked with a handheld GPS at the time of removal, and that allows us to kind of track the progress and create some fancy maps such as this. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail about them, but just wanted to provide them to give an idea of where the kind of the hot spots are that we deal with. So areas that are managed year after year and high density areas, it's really, we want to focus on depleting those seed banks time after time. And really, it's not just those heavy areas. We also revisit areas with low occurrence to make sure that we didn't miss any plants from year to year, as well as nearby suitable habitat where they could pop up if there was a seed that had kind of transferred downstream. So really, you know, it's quite an effort. And luckily for me, when we see on the next slide here, not sure, there's a bit of a lag. There we go. A lot of the heavy lifting was before I came into the program in 2017. So, so I've gotten to do a little bit more paddling, I'm sure, than Justin did in the first few years. So the results overall have actually been very positive to date. And since 2014, we've noticed an 83% overall reduction in the amount of water chestnut at this site. We're removing, you know, in the first year, it was about 60 garbage cans full that Justin had removed. And to kind of put it in perspective, you know, we were only removing about 3 to 4 at the end of the year for us. But a lot of that time was really spent doing that overwater search to make sure that we're removing everything that's left over. And reason being, we know that these populations can really rebound in short order. That Lewis Bay population was first identified in 2017 and made up about a third of all the water chestnut that I removed that year. It had been visited 2 years prior. And so really 2 years prior, the plant wasn't there. When we did this late season surveillance, we found just a ton of it. It really doesn't take long. So that's been a pretty major part of the program. And so we've had other populations pop up as well and have worked quickly and effectively to deal with these as well. And so one of them is the Black Rapids population. So since 2015, we've managed this population in the Rideau River, and it's just upstream of the Black Rapids Dam in Ottawa within the Rideau Canal system. It was large enough to warrant a community pull event for the first 2 years of control. And you can see in that top photo there, it's pretty thick. However, by 2017, there was no longer a need for a community event because of the reductions in size. And for the past 3 years, we've been managing this with the help of the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, as well as Parks Canada. And so overall, we've seen a 98% reduction in the cover of water chestnut in the river. And you can see us with our huge haul of 7 Rubbermaid bins of water chestnut. So lastly, with the water chestnut program, I'm going to talk about our experience with chemical control. So in late 2015, Justin had identified a new population, discovered this one within the Greater Cataraqui River, which is located in the Rideau Canal system within the inner harbor of Kingston. And it was located along the shorelines of Bell Park, which is a large peninsula that sticks out into the river, where there's lots of slow-moving water beside that navigational channel. So control at the site was stalled over concerns with sediment toxicity at the site. There was a tannery on the adjacent land and in previous years, and so really our concerns were over remobilization of the sediment and exposure to our staff through hand pulling efforts. Working with the MNRF, the MEC, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and Ministry of Environment, Conservation, Parks, and Parks Canada, we deemed it an ideal candidate for a chemical control treatment and using the aquatic herbicide Reward. This is the only registered aquatic herbicide that we have available for use in Canada. And the product is a contact herbicide. So really it only kills the vascular tissue that it comes in contact with, rather than say a systemic herbicide that's often used for say Phragmites that can translocate into the roots. In 2017, we started the preparations for this work. And since it was the first treatment, we wanted to make sure that we monitored the efficacy of the control, and to do so, we developed a point intercept sampling method to monitor changes in the floating leaf cover at the site before and after treatment. And so this consisted of 10 by 10 meter point intercept grid that was put over the area. And at each point, we would stop with a handheld GPS on the point and take a quadrat, kind of do a visual estimate over a 2 meter by 2 meter area to get an idea of sparse, moderate, and dense cover of these floating leaf plants. We were unable to make the timing window to do the treatment in 2017, just due to the life history of the plant and kind of timing, just the way the things kind of processed throughout the year. But we were able to perform the first overwater treatment with a reward in Canada in 2018. And this groundwork really helped. You can see the map here from 2017. This really helped us when it came to procuring herbicide in a contractor, because we knew how big the infestation was and really what our target was. So with the treatment planned, what we did is we planned the treatment in mid-July. So this would happen after the timing for protection of fish spawning, and it was still early enough that we were able to target the plants before seed development occurs. So since we anticipated regrowth following the treatment, we decided before time to do a second treatment in mid-August. So these surveys were actually performed before the initial treatment and then 2 weeks after the first and 2 weeks after the second treatment. So what did we find? So the maps at the bottom here, they show the pre-treatment, post-first treatment, and post-second treatment water chestnut density within our survey area. The darker the color, the more dense the population. So the lighter is sparse, under 20%. Above, between 20 and 60% cover within that quadrat is moderate, and dense was above 60% cover. So following our first treatment in mid-July, we observed a 61% reduction in overall water chestnut presence. The picture on the left shows the browning of the leaves that you can see here. And we did have some regrowth of or some green stems left over. And 2 weeks later, we did notice some regrowth of these stems. So we knew, the second treatment was needed. So following that second treatment, we observed a 92% reduction in water chestnut presence, and the plants found within the quadrats were very sparse, really only consisting of typically 1 to 2 weakened rosettes. They're very small in size in comparison to the large rosettes we typically find at the end of August. Later that year, while performing some surveillance throughout the river, we found a small satellite population just on the south side of the island of Bell Park, kind of tucked into the outflow of a creek. And with this new population, we decided to treat that as well and rename the two sites Bell North for the original and Bell South for the new satellite population. And in 2019, we basically repeated the same approach that we used in 2018. However, this year, the overall presence of water chestnut the starting presence was actually 50% lower than what we had in 2018, likely due to the lack of seeds that were developed and dropped at the end of the 2018 season. So after this, it is actually important to note that we also observed sparse cover during our surveys early in the season, whereas the pre-treatment in 2018, we had populations that had already started to really bump up in size. So the overall cover and the cover within each one of those quadrats was much less. And so overall, we ended up with very similar results, but very, very great, actually. 67% reduction after the first treatment and 97% after the second treatment. And then with respect to the small satellite population on the south side, we treated this at the same time. And what we noticed was a 95% reduction after the first treatment, and it had completely disappeared following the second. So we're pretty excited overall about the results of the herbicide treatment, and happy that we had gone through the extra effort of doing all of the surveying as well, just to really determine how effective it was. There was a lot of legwork behind the scenes to get this project up and running, and it really included a lot of coordination with our partners, as well as the provincial, federal, and local levels of government, based on the location of the plants, as well as access and the necessary permits that we needed. But one thing I'd like to note before I kind of move on is really the presence of the native plant community. So while performing our field surveys, we also monitored the percent cover of other floating leaf species, which included white and yellow water lily that were present at the site. Yellow water lily was mostly found around the shoreline, didn't really change much in population, but we did have white water lily, which was actually the dominant species throughout the entire area. And we did notice that it did increase in cover over each summer, as you would expect if no herbicide treatment had taken place. In addition to the maps here, I've got a picture that kind of shows a few of the browning rosettes of water chestnut and some surviving floating leaf cover. I think it's white water lily, it looks like there. And I think this is a really important point to make. It's really having experienced herbicide applicators that are doing these projects. Our contractors were able to effectively treat the target species and minimize its impact on native beneficial native plants. So really, we're pretty excited. Moving forward with the program, I'm not really going to go too much into detail beyond this, but moving forward with the program, our focus really remains the same. So we want to limit the production of new seeds, and we want to deplete the established seed banks that are present. And then also on top of that, continue doing our surveillance to make sure that we seek out new populations before they get established. So at this point, I'm going to, transition out of the floating leaf aquatic plant world, and we're going to talk a little bit about parrot feather. So just a couple of things. It is a pretty unique species. There's not much that we have here in Ontario that quite looks like it or really behaves like it as well. So it should be exciting for me to talk about, hopefully exciting to listen to. And really, it's kind of interesting, for the first part, we were talking about a floating leaf aquatic plant that is dependent on seed to proliferate. Whereas now we're going to be talking about a perennial species, so one that's able to survive year after year, which is a shoreline species that does not produce viable seed in North America, but it is capable of emergent submergent growth, which is pretty interesting. So a little bit about the plant. It is a member of the milfoil family, which includes the infamous Eurasian water milfoil, which has been a troublesome problem for decades across North America. It is both submerged and it does have both submerged and emergent growth. The submerged leaves are limp and feathery, and they're very similar to other milfoil species. As the shoots emerge out of the water, the shoots become rigid and the leaves become rigid as well. They're a little shorter in length. And when the light just hits them the right way, they have this really nice bluish green hue. It's quite spectacular. But the flowers themselves are not so spectacular. They're pretty inconspicuous, little white to pinkish, and about a meter or 1.5 millimeters in length. In North America, we only have female plants. The plant is dioecious, so it does not produce viable seed in North America. So really, the main way that it does spread is by fragments through the stems and stolons. And so these stems can reach 2 meters in length, often extending through the water column. You can grow upwards of 30 centimeters above the water. These plants are capable of growing in water deeper than 2 meters, but you don't see that emergent growth in the deeper water. These stolons, as mentioned, do play a vital role. They really do with the perenniation of the species, since there's no overwintering structures for the plants, nothing like a winter bud or turion, and they don't drop seeds. And they do facilitate spreads through fragmentation. So the species is native to the Amazon basin, and it was first introduced in the late 1800s as well as an ornamental. It does thrive in subtropical regions, and has done a good job of establishing itself throughout the southeastern United States. but can also be found in small isolated populations along, in a majority of the states, about 38 states, I believe, in the lower 48, as well as along the coastal regions. It has not been discovered in the Great Lakes, but it is present in each one of the Great Lakes states and locally here in Ontario. It has been a troublesome weed for lower mainland British Columbia as well, and Vancouver Island, where winters are not as harsh. So the spread is facilitated through fragmentation of these shoots and stolons, as mentioned. And it really thrives in slow-moving, nutrient-rich waters and grows best in shallow water with wet shoreline soils. And it does have quite an adaptable range of physical light and temperature conditions that it can grow in. Oh, I might have sent the slide a little too far forward. Bit of a delay. Oh, okay, we're great. So there are some similarities with water chestnut, and really with a lot of aquatic invasive plants as well, where the impacts typically are related to dense monotypic stands that can compete for light and resources, negative impacts on habitat and wildlife, lower dissolved oxygen due to dieback of dense mats, and impedance in navigation flow. And here's a good example in the Serpentine Wildlife Management Area in Surrey, BC, that's managed by Ducks Unlimited out of our Richmond office. So once established, the plant can be very difficult to control. And really those major reasons are the growth fragmentation, which I've mentioned probably a bunch at this point, and the ability to survive in a wide range of conditions. In the US, parrot feather is commonly controlled with the use of systemic herbicides such as 2,4-D and triclopyr. However, in Ontario, we only have Reward as available. It is a contact herbicide, so it only kills the tissue it comes in contact with. It will not translocate to the stolon, so really it's not too effective in that respect. You can have some dieback, but it would just be a repetitive measure. There are a range of mechanical methods that can be employed and are dependent on site conditions, and they include backfilling, excavation, water level drawdown, benthic barriers, tarping, and hand pulling. So looking back at this, at the Serpentine Wildlife Management Area, the populations in this large wetland are actually, so this population can be controlled through water level drawdowns that our conservation staff out of Richmond have been using, and using a water control structure where they can raise and lower the water levels. So they lower it for a summer drawdown to desiccate the plant, and then raise the water levels back up to aid in the waterfowl staging and migration. This has led to drastic reductions in the cover, and so now they're using benthic mats and harvesting to control those persistent plants that are kind of found in the wet soils that don't completely dry out from the drawdown. So they've done this for several years and are having great results. Control efforts in Canada are really currently limited to those different mechanical means, and the focus should really be on complete removal of the plants where possible, or weakening the overwintering capability of the plants where they can't be completely destroyed. So what are we doing here in Ontario? So until 2016, parrot feather was available for sale at nurseries and water gardens. However, this is no longer the case with its designation as a prohibited species in the province. And in 2006, the first observed and I guess uncontrolled unintroduced population on purpose was identified in Municipal Pond in Midhurst, Ontario, and this pond was backfilled in order to eradicate the population. And this method has been used several times with the earlier populations as they've been discovered. We've had some experience with this too. In 2017, we were approached by a landowner regarding a parrot feather issue in her pond. We confirmed the presence of the plant and discussed control options with the landowner and with the Natural Heritage Information Center with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And through some invasive species funding that was provided by Invasive Species Center, I think it was response funding, we were able to backfill the pond and eradicate the population. So this isn't always the case. And I guess in recent years, we've had some experience employing different techniques to deal with the plant. So following this initial parrot feather project that we had, our conservation staff with Ducks Unlimited became more informed about the plant and of the work that we were doing. And while performing a site visit of a constructed pond in Hamilton, in the Hamilton area, one of our conservation staff noticed a unique plant that was growing and suspected it to be parrot feather, which we were able to confirm was in fact parrot feather. So the pond itself was constructed in 2012, and sometime thereafter, the plant was purchased at a local nursery and introduced to the pond. This is while it was still available through ornamental trade. Our invasive team assessed the situation, and we determined that backfilling wasn't an option for this population, really due to the size of the pond. And in addition, it was attached to a creek that flows roughly 200 meters downstream before reaching some irrigation ponds that the creek travels through for mixed agricultural use, as well as a tree nursery. So during our initial site visit in early June of 2018, we were able to remove some of the plant tissue by very, very slowly pulling up individual shoots of the plant and being very, very careful not to create any fragments that would potentially create new establishments downstream. We also searched the downstream creek along the property and upstream along the creek to see if we could find any more shoots. We did find a few that had naturally just washed downstream, as well as fragments of stolons from the previous year that had washed downstream. So following this initial site visit, we were able to receive some funding from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in order to perform some additional site visits in an attempt to do some more hand pulling of the population. In addition, we also reached out to the adjacent and downstream landowners to extend our search downstream and into the irrigation ponds below. So during the second site visit, which was it was later in the month, we were able to remove roughly 15 Rubbermaid bins of parrot feather from the pond, and as well as the creek downstream. And we were very cautious not to create fragments, and had installed a screen at the outflow of the pond to catch any fragments in case there were any others coming from that source population. So in September, we returned to perform a follow-up to control the parrot feather that was in the pond and in the creek. And at this point, we identified that the population downstream in the creek on the adjacent landowner's property had excessive growth since our last visit. And so hand removal really proved to be difficult. So within the pond, we have loose substrates that make it easy to pull the plants. But in the creek, the stolons and stems were kind of intertwined with the other shoreline vegetation. And in addition, small shoots were hidden within the thick grasses and kind of the undercuts of the bank, and were difficult to locate. So we decided to leave everything in place at this point over concerns of exacerbating the issue. There was a lot of, for something this large, we were really concerned about creating a lot of fragments. So over the winter months, we worked with the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Invasive Species Center to kind of determine our next steps. We reached out to some experts who deal with the plants in the US, and considered aggressive approaches such as excavating the creek bed to remove any of the tissue, all of the tissue, I guess, or an emergency use of a systemic herbicide. However, excavation would have been really costly, and the creek, since it flows into a series of irrigation ponds, we figured it probably wasn't a good idea to put a systemic herbicide into the water, especially for the tree nursery. Ultimately, we decided to do some extensive hand pulling again in 2019. So during our first site visit in June of 2019, we were surprised to see only a handful of plants which were removed. Since populations were low, we performed monthly site visits to remove any new growth that was observed. By low, I mean we only had literally handfuls of plants that we were pulling out of the pond and out of the creek. We felt really that this would limit the ability of any surviving plants to allocate resources back into the stolons. So really, if we, going back monthly, just making sure that we remove any of that above ground growth and as much of the stolons as we can, so that they're not allocating back in for that overwinter survival. And we also continued our surveillance downstream, and were unable to find anything within the irrigation ponds downstream, as well as more landowners that we've added. So this slide really shows the comparison between the first and second year at the site, and you can see parrot feather had dramatically decreased. It's quite interesting. So the reduction of this population is likely due to the control efforts as well as harsh winter conditions and the plant phenology as well. So in the soft substrates, we're able to remove deep running stolons through our control efforts, lessening the amount of tissue that can survive the winter. So parrot feather isn't affected by frost, but it is susceptible to freezing. So really, it's likely that the population is able to survive so long, being able to overwinter effectively year after year within the pond, since it can survive under the ice. Whereas the plants in the creek were more susceptible to freezing through winter months. So the reduction in the large stream population downstream is likely due to those harsh winter conditions in 2018 and 2019. It likely led to freezing the overwintering tissue in the shallow waters. We did observe some shoots in the creek in 2019. You can see I circled them here in this exact same location. I've circled them here. They were quite small in comparison. And really, the control efforts in 2019 built on the success of the previous year, and it's likely that repetitive harvesting events that we performed in 2019 will weaken the plants even more severely for the winter that we just had and seem to still have from time to time. Just crazy. So what have we learned with this project? Well, we've learned a lot about the species really over the past few years with some persistence and good luck, really good luck with the weather conditions. We've had some successful results from hand pulling parrot feather. Something to keep in mind, it is susceptible to freezing as mentioned, and there's no doubt it can successfully overwinter in Ontario. So with a changing climate and the potential for milder winter conditions, it's likely that survival of the species on the landscape could increase. But measures taken by the province to prohibit the sale or possession of parrot feather is likely going to limit the potential for future releases. So we're happy to see that that it has been included as a prohibited species on the Invasive Species Act. So moving forward, our goal is really to continue towards eradication of this population and engage our local landowners, monitor the species as we're going forward, and continue moving with an adaptive management approach. So I've thrown a ton of information at you guys over a short amount of time. I've got a couple of slides that I'm just going to kind of breeze over, but some of the challenges that we have with invasive species management, every project's different. The type of infestation, the local site conditions, site access can be difficult, especially for aquatic systems, and downstream impacts. As well, each plant has a different set of characteristics that make it thrive and make it difficult to control. We have limitations on available tools such as harvesters and mechanical equipment for some projects. We don't have a lot of herbicide use, which is fine, I think anyway, for the way that we've been managing things thus far. And there's really in Ontario, we don't have quite the professional experience that they have in areas like the US. So we depend a lot on the US for that information. So permitting for in-water work can also be difficult at times. It can be difficult to navigate, can limit our work, and optimal timing for control and fish protection don't always line up. It'd be best if we could get at these things early on. And always funding, the need for long-term sustainable funding is always something that we're working with. So, and lastly, what can you do in general? Get to know your aquatic plants. I know I like to. If you see something suspicious, report it. So we have in Ontario the invading species hotline, as well as EDDMAPS Ontario, where you can post information about reports that you see. Clean, drain, dry your boat, and do not release aquarium plants into natural ecosystems. For those of you that are performing active aquatic plant control, it's best to consult in Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry prior to any control events efforts, or your local natural resources agency. Determine what permits and authorizations are needed, and learn from your partners in previous projects. And definitely research plant life history and control methods, and tailor your approach around those. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for sitting through if you made it this far. I've got a picture here. This is actually a picture of myself and the water soldier management technician with Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Rob McGowan. We were doing some late season water chestnut and water soldier surveillance in the Bay of Quinte last year. I felt this was a nice slide to have up since he's going to be the next speaker in this webinar series. So I guess I'm going to pass this back over to Leah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kyle. Really excellent webinar. And kudos to the Ducks Unlimited team and all the partners involved, because it certainly seems like these projects are a very massive undertaking, and your results are an inspiration for all of us. So we have some questions coming in here on the side. We have just under 10 minutes, so we'll get through a couple of them here. I see one here that was actually asked twice. So the attendees are wondering if you could speak to your disposal method for the invasive species. There was one in regards to European water chestnut, and then also wondering for parrot feather as well.
Perfect. Thanks so much for bringing up that question. It is something that I guess I didn't talk about at all. So the nice thing with a lot of aquatic plants, once they're out of the water, if you can completely desiccate the plant, they are not viable anymore. So that's kind of the key thing is what we've been doing for water chestnut and parrot feather is disposing them on land more than 30 meters away from shore in a location that they're not going to be easily reintroduced. And so, you know, this can include, you know, putting them in an area that since they are prohibited species too, we try to do these in areas of property that we have, and really, you know, trying to limit any potential for reintroduction. But they do desiccate pretty quickly, so just up on land and dry them out.
Okay, and then we have a couple questions about the water chestnut. So the first one was someone was wondering how water chestnut is pollinated.
That's a great question. I was digging through some of the literature, and so the review I was reading actually said that they weren't too sure the means of pollination. We do have a lot of we do see a lot of flying insects around the plants. The flowers themselves do stick above the water, so it's likely that you're seeing, you know, I guess small pollinators kind of moving around.
We have a question here about someone wondering if you know how many cubic meters of biomass are removed from the water in Voyageur Provincial Park for the European water chestnut.
Unfortunately, I don't have that information. It really puts it makes the work that we're doing seem very trivial in comparison to the amount of control that they're taking. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have numbers on that. Like the sheer volume of it is unlike anything that we've had to deal with our program, and really because of the you know, the work that they're doing there, we're really jumping on populations before they become that widespread.
Okay, jumping over to parrot feather here, we have a question about whether you can elaborate on the control efforts and the effects on fish populations.
Control efforts for I guess in respect to, I'm going to just assume that's with the water level drawdowns. What we did was very well, the backfilling of the pond definitely made for unideal, I guess, conditions for the fish that in the ponds that we were working with. We actually had gone through and removed the fish, goldfish from the pond that we backfilled and moved them into another pond that she had on her property. But really with the hand pulling, we haven't had an issue. The water level drawdowns in the Serpentine Wildlife Management Area, I don't have the specifics on that, but likely, you know, if you're, it is controlled by a water control structure, so likely these ponds remain offline for several years as well. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak too much to that project.
Okay, there is a similar question then. I'm not sure if you know about fish mortality in relation to the herbicide use.
Sure. Yeah, you know, it's one of those ones where I don't have a number on fish mortality. When the treatment applications that we had done, diquat is a very short-lived It has a very short residency time in the water. Once it comes in contact with sediment, it does immobilize. All of the work that we have done is with experienced contractors that are following guidelines set out by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And so really it's following the label instructions provided by Health Canada to limit the impact on fish and other vertebrates as well.
And there's another question about how you decide between manual control options and chemical control options at a site.
Sure. So for a lot of the work that we've done, it has been manual control, and for the reason being, a lot of the populations are small and they can be effectively managed that way. Chemical control, really, we used it really in the greater Cataraqui area because of those concerns over sediment mobilization. Typically when, large-scale control that's kind of performed in the US, for example, for water chestnut, for example, in New York State, they'll do areas that are, upwards of several dozens of hectares in populations. But really, I think part of it probably comes down to cost as well, and time and effort. So for those larger populations, they can be easier to control and reduce in size with chemical treatment. And as for these plants, at least, we're able to manage them with mechanical control once they're in a smaller isolated pocket. But every plant's different, it's and every site condition is different. So it's really trying to tailor the best, the preferred method for each. We've been very lucky with our water chestnut program, where we've been able to do most of the work with hand pulling, and it's with that we do know we get really good, effective results because we're removing the entire plant roots and all.
All right, so we're almost at 12, so I think we will finish up with one more question, but we do have a few that we weren't able to get to, so you're more than welcome. I see Kyle's put his email up on the screen here, and mine should be available in your email as well, so feel free to send us an email and we can answer any other questions you have. So we have one here, sort of a fun hypothetical question. So
okay.
If you have an isolated pond in southern Ontario and you introduce 10 individuals of European water chestnut, parrot feather, Eurasian water milfoil, and water soldier, what would the pond look like in 5 years?
Oh, it looked like the best place to receive some funding to do some aquatic plant work. That's a great question. I think you'd end up with I don't know. I think water soldier and water chestnut would have a good competition going between cover. But I think water soldier would probably take over the area. You'd likely see some water. I would assume Eurasian water milfoil would kind of work its way through in between the gaps where it can, and you'd have parrot feather along the shorelines. But water soldier is really quite a beast, and I'm sure it would just take over the entire water column.
Well, that's actually a really great segue, because our next webinar coming up, as you mentioned, is going to be about water soldier. So with that one, for the sake of time, we're going to just wrap up here. Again, feel free to send us any questions that you might have that we weren't able to get to. So thank you again, Kyle, for presenting today, and thank you to everyone who had a chance to tune in. This webinar was recorded, and we're going to be posting it on our website. Again, that's www.invasivespeciescenter.ca, and it'll also be up on our YouTube channel. Reminder, if you have time, please fill out the survey at the end. We really appreciate your feedback. And then our next webinar, it's going to be on May 22nd at 11 a.m. And we will be joined by Robert McGowan from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and he will be speaking about the multi-partner control program for water soldier, which is a unique invasive aquatic plant in the Trent Severn Waterway in Ontario. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great day.